Hello, I have some thoughts for you about tight hamstrings and practicing with tight hamstrings. No, don't everybody rush. I know everybody says like, oh, but my hamstrings are really tight. No, they're not. We'll talk about why we magically all feel that way, even despite the fact that we all have different ranges of movement. It's kind of an interesting thing that we all happen to feel the same way about our hamstrings. But this video is for folks with actually tight hamstrings. So, so first and foremost, we're going to talk about the way to get. There's kind of two ways to go about practicing with tight hamstrings. The first is you want to really practice getting as much length through the backs of the legs as possible, and that's not happening by rounding the upper body forward. So as you can see, my hamstring hasn't really changed lengths at all. I've just reached towards the floor. So first and foremost, we want to be moving from the right place. Namely, you want to be creasing from the hips. So instead of shortening the front of my torso to try to reach the floor, I'm going to try to crease my hips at the top of the leg where the leg joins the torso, and I'm going to try to lift the center of my butt cheeks up and back. In fact, it might even help you to find the center of the butt cheeks and try to lift them up and back. As you lean forward, you might even find these two little bony bits in the bottom of your butt. That's what we want. We want to lengthen the space between the center of the butt cheek and the heel. So if I fold from the top crease of the leg and I really focus on lifting the hamstrings up and back, that's going to bring more length into the legs. Now, I might still not be able to touch the floor, especially if my hamstrings are very, very tight. So what I want to do is I want to bring something underneath my hands so that I'm not hanging in space, because hanging in space essentially loads. It puts extra load bearing on the structures of the low back, which in this case isn't what we want. And two, if my hands are actually secure into something, I have more muscular control over the shape that I'm trying to get. So if my hands are down, that gives me enough space to really work with lengthening the back of the leg as much as I can. So in this case, we're working with kind of more of a elongated trunk, and we're working with some props in order to bring more length into the back of the leg. It might be the case that even with blocks on the tallest setting, you can't reach them, in which case you could use the back of a chair, or you could even use a wall to have some support. So you could start with your hands on a chair and walking the feet back and trying to lift the center of the buttocks up and back, and again bringing length into the back of the leg. So I'm avoiding rounding forward. I'm trying to bring length into the front and the back body, and length into the backs of the legs here. And the real tell is you'll feel the difference, right? When you are approaching, you want, you're gonna have more sensation in the backs of the legs. You're gonna have less sensation in the backs of the legs, and maybe not at all if you're like moving from the back and from the spine and from the waist. So that's one way to work with tight hamstrings. Another way is to bend the knees. So for example, if I can't reach, one option is to bend the knees quite a lot, and again, I'm almost trying to arch my back to get my hands down to the floor. And I'm trying to get kind of my thighs towards my abdomen. Now, This is okay for a couple of reasons. One is that, again, it's good to have the hands able to press into something so that we don't have extra load bearing happening in the back. And you might think to yourself like, well, doesn't knees bent not really give us more stretch in the hamstrings? You would be partially right, except that we can't really just take the hamstrings out as their own individual unique experience. The hamstrings are also connected to the glute flexibility, to calf flexibility, and also to hip flexibility. So when I place my hands down, I'm definitely working hip crease and hip flexibility, and I'm also a little bit working the glute flexibility, which might give me more access to the hamstrings eventually, depending on where the tightness is occurring. So my suggestion would be, in those moments during a practice where we're like moving through the vinyasa, or what, yoga teachers love to say that, move through your vinyasa. So for example, in sun salutations, you could use the bending knee variation where you can touch the floor, work on your flexibility, move through your sun salutation, feel that sense of security and groundedness that the hands give you, work on lifting the tailbone up, and that's all well and good. And then later in the practice, when you're really trying to get some flexibility and some length out of the muscles, then you could work more on tilting the sitting bones up, lengthening the back, and get more of a stretch, even though all these words have their pitfalls as well. So, stretch isn't the only thing to experience in our yoga shapes. So it's not that we're always looking for a stretch under every circumstance, but this gives you a couple of ways to practice as you're moving through. Another place that's going to come up for you is in seated. So if you sit on the floor with the legs straight out in front of you, if your back is already rounded and it's difficult or even impossible to sit up straight, then the first thing to do is to get something under your seat. It could be that you need to sit on some blocks or sit on a blanket to lift your seat up off the floor. In certain extreme cases, you may also wish to sit at the edge of a chair so that you can really sit up nice and tall. And then from wherever, see, the reason that sitting on something helps is because it increases, the geometry nerds out there are going to come find me, it increases the angle between your trunk and the legs. So if there's a limitation in the hamstrings, then the smaller this angle gets, the more intense the pull gets on the hamstrings. So the first thing is to sit in such a way where you can lengthen upwards and not round the back. And then second is that you want to grab something that you can hold onto your feet with. I'm using a yoga belt in this case. You could use a towel or a blanket or a shirt. And again, instead of like trying to get yourself forward with it, we don't necessarily even need to think about forward just yet. We can think of going upwards. So I think of lifting my crown of my head upwards away from my tailbone. I think of trying to lengthen the front of the body as much as I'm lengthening the back of the body. And then I think of pulling my chest forward towards the toes. For those of you with tight hamstrings, this should be plenty. This might be plenty intense. So work here for a little while. And just notice that in trying to go forward this way with the back rounded, even though you're putting all your energy into trying to go forward, but you might be missing some sensation in the back of the legs. In fact, compare that experience to then lifting up to go forward, and then you might feel more sensation in the backs of the legs, which means that we're putting our attention where we want it to go. And again, stretching the hamstrings isn't the only point of this particular shape, but in the case of very, very, very tight hamstrings, where the goal is to lengthen the hamstrings, then let that sensation be part of what guides you into the right shape. So comparing going forward to going upwards, and even I have pretty good hamstrings. Even I feel more in my hamstrings when I go up instead of forward. So try those couple of techniques and good luck.